Welcome everyone to the NISGIC Annual Conference 2021 on-demand presentation by AppGeo, and this is titled The Operational Reality of Statewide Data Ambitions, an exploration of 3 models. And we have a really exciting on-demand presentation for you today, and after a couple quick introductions, we'll be getting started. So we have 2 excellent presenters for you all today, and these are 2 folks that should be no strangers to this audience. We have Bill Johnson, our Carpe Geo evangelist here at AppGeo, and Kate Hickey, our Chief Operating Officer. Now, AppGeo and NISGIC go way back together, and AppGeo is proud to be a long-running NISGIC sponsor, as we, as well as NISGIC, are in our 30th year. And we're based in Boston and have employees in many different parts of the country. And as many of you know, AppGeo is dedicated to solving all sorts of geospatial problems and being your trusted advisor when it comes to geospatial technology products as well as services. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Kate to start our presentation for today. Kate, take it away.
Thank you, Aaron. So as many of you know, AppGeo has been doing geospatial strategic planning for many years now. I think it's around 15. Altogether, we've completed more than 35 enterprise strategic and business plans across the country, doing that type of work in 24 different states. And lately, we've really seen a resurgence in this type of work. Just in the past year, we've been working with Richard and Felicia in Texas, Megan in Indiana, Aaron in Montana, plus dozens of others in prior years. But really, this work is not just about working with the GIOs. It's about reaching that broader stakeholder community, the state agencies, the local governments, the private sector companies, the nonprofits, really all of those who participate in and benefit from that state GIS coordination. And it's really helped us understand the variety of use cases and perspectives and motivations across these stakeholders. It's also helped us recognize that while every state is different, their unique challenges, their unique opportunities, certainly unique personalities, but a common strategic goal that keeps presenting itself over and over again is that goal to achieve and sustain statewide enterprise data, whether that's parcels or addresses or roads. It's something that every state is challenged by, and it really looms large in these plans.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And before we go any further, I have to chuckle a little bit at this map that we've got here, because I see that Massachusetts, where AppGeo is based, is now south of Pennsylvania. And interestingly, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is now between North Carolina and South Carolina.
So we should have made this a trivia question here. Find the errors in the map here. So.
Right, but not to make too much light of that, but your point about what we've learned from these strategic plans is really spot on, in that it hasn't really gotten easier to do these enterprise data projects. We've had a lot of technology advancements and the tools that we have, but the process of working with a wide range of stakeholders to bring these data together is hard. And the real key here that we've learned is that it's the non-technical aspects that make this challenging. And what we want to present here today is we've taken this body of understanding and collapsed it into a framework of 3 different models that we think capture the ranges of approaches that we see out there. And these models encompass a variety of factors. They encompass the governance, the funding, the authority, who's controlling what happens in these things, data standards, data sharing policies, and each of these has to be adapted to every state's unique operating environment and circumstances. So let's get into it. All right, so here's the 3 models. You'll see on here decentralized on the left and centralized on the right. I think those 2 are probably fairly obvious in what they mean. And in the middle, we have one called Federated. And before we go any further, I want to just pause here and offer a brief definition of federated. When you look up the dictionary definition of federated, it means to be included in a federation. And then when you look at a federation, it's defined as a group where there is some central authority, but the members of that group retain some autonomy on their own. And that's exactly the way the U.S. Constitution sets up our government. The federal level of government has only certain powers, and the rest of the powers in our government structure are reserved for the states. And so when you think about this in a data environment, what we're talking about with a federated model is a blend of authority where there's some centralization of authority to provide that structure, that framework, and then the participating entities, and then a state data project, that's the counties and the local governments within that state, they also retain autonomy and authority over the actions of the whole process. So let's just start with the simpler two, the decentralized and the centralized. In a decentralized, the decisions remain local. And they can resolve everything without escalating, and these are the simplest to have in place. They're kind of the default, really, and but they tend to lead to inconsistencies when you try to roll the data up into an enterprise class project. The other extreme is the centralized model, and here you have a central authority that makes all the decisions. And there's a strong focus on setting up those policies and then enforcing compliance among all the partners. And this can also be difficult to implement because it really requires a strong authority, and that generally happens through legislation and especially through who controls the funding. Because when you have control of the money, you have control of how things happen. And when you look at this range of three, you want to think about it as a continuum, because what we're going to see here when we go through this is there's very few examples of anything that's purely decentralized or purely federated or purely centralized. Everything can kind of fall somewhere along the spectrum. So don't think of these as three discrete boxes. Think of these as a range, and your circumstances may put you partway in between some of these positions. And it's really a management strategy. We think by giving you this structure and this framework, it will help you understand what you're able to do and how it aligns with your particular objectives, and also will help you understand that you have options. In every one of these, there are a number of choices that you can make that are slightly more federated or less centralized, or all of those things. And so let's go into these individually in a little bit more detail.
Sure, that sounds great, Bill. Let's start with what was on the far right there, the centralized, and I couldn't agree more that most of the use cases we look at fall somewhere on the continuum. But as we were preparing for this presentation, there are some obvious examples that kind of fall on one end of the spectrum or the other. Statewide imagery being an excellent example of a centralized model. So, when you think about how most states are approaching imagery right now, I think it's accepted across the board that the buying power of a single contract, that negotiating and buying power at the state level makes a lot of sense. It's very costly and inefficient for counties to be producing their own imagery, negotiating those contracts. And it creates other problems, as most of the use cases for imagery, you want to look at areas, compare areas across the state. But if the flights are at different times, or they're different resolution, or they're different tiling schemes, or even different radiometric characteristics, you can't do that comparison. You don't have that snapshot in time there. So, one of the greatest examples, a customer near and dear to us is Texas. The 254 counties, 268,000 square miles. Imagine trying to do that in a decentralized way. They moved to a centralized imagery program with the purchase of the Google imagery in 2015. They're now using the Hexagon statewide imagery content program, and they're serving it up through our Giza imagery streaming platform. And they're reaching hundreds of thousands of users with this statewide enterprise asset. And the ROI is just enormous for Texas.
Yeah, and of course, imagery is a great example of how a centralized program works. And we see this in very many states. And really, it's kind of interesting how the way the market has shifted in recent years with the advent of these content programs, which really make it even more compelling to centralize because imagery is becoming a commodity. And these content programs that are out there that offer licensed imagery are really built around some very large other clients that are paying for the imagery in the first instance, whether it be the big internet companies or the NAPE program or the consortia of insurance companies that are buying imagery in the first instance. And so the cost advantage of a content program really makes the centralizing a model even more compelling than it had been in the past. So I think it's a great example.
And we should mention here, we're talking about imagery, but LiDAR is another great example. LiDAR elevation data. I know it's on the minds of many of you, and it's another excellent example of where it makes sense to do this in a centralized manner with one entity really negotiating and purchasing that data asset. So many of you, investing in this, doing it to the USGS 3DEP program specs and providing that asset out to all of the state stakeholders.
Yeah, that's right, Kate. And actually 3DEP is interesting in that it takes the centralization model up to another level. Because when you think about it, the 3DEP program is a nationwide specification. So it's not stopping at a centralized state level. Right. It's centralized really at a national scale through a common set of specifications across the US. That's really a great example.
Right. So Bill, let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum here. Local data, decentralized models. What do you think here?
Well, what I think here is that decentralized, I think the first definition I would offer is this is what happens in the absence of state leadership, where everyone is on their own. And it's not really that anybody is doing anything wrong, quote unquote. They're just doing things themselves and making it work for their own particular situation. And, among state agencies that typically they're focusing on their own missions and maybe are less aware of potential duplications of effort that might be going on with other agencies that have similar data requirements. And sometimes we see that agencies have a fully funded program to do things a certain way, and they can be very reluctant to disrupt that. And, one of the things I learned from a long career in government is that inertia in government is a pretty powerful force. But beyond that, I think we can also look at decentralization as the default for a lot of local data, things like parcels and addresses, which those are based on local responsibility. Processing of parcels and in the assignment and maintenance of addresses both reside at the local level of government across the US. And now what we've seen is there are business drivers that have moved management of those two layers, parcels and addresses, into either a centralized or a federated model. And we'll talk more about that in our webinars later this fall. On the other hand, we see some local data like zoning or infrastructure data for water or wastewater, those sorts of things. Those typically remain decentralized because right now there's not a state level business driver to move those into a more centralized or a federated model.
Yeah, we definitely see this a lot. We work with a lot of local governments, especially in the Northeast, and many of them, all of them are maintaining zoning data or special boundaries delineating special districts or school districts. And there really is at this point, no interest beyond those municipal boundaries. The zoning bylaws go back hundreds of years in some cases, and they really have no relationship to how their neighboring municipality is managing that data. And this is kind of hyper local in a place like New England, where the counties have very little significance. A small state like Massachusetts, there are 351 municipalities, no unincorporated land, and each one of them is maintaining a zoning data set among probably many other local data sets that is really only relevant within those maybe 5 or 6, maybe 10 square miles, very, very, very localized. So a good example of decentralized data governance.
Okay. Well, let's move on to this third one, the federated model. And, for certain data layers, I think the federated model really is the sweet spot that combines the best of both centralized and decentralized. And it can also be the trickiest model to do well because it requires a very high level of coordination and also a very high level of cooperation among all of the partners involved. And, we've previously seen parcel data fall into this federated model, and it continues to happen that way. But more recently, we're seeing address data fall into this federated model, and that's largely because of the requirements around next generation 911.
It's interesting, Bill. You mentioned that the heavy need for coordination and cooperation on these federated data models. And really what that's pointing to is the non-technical elements. And time again, what we're seeing in strategic planning is that those are the most challenging for any GIO, for any organization. It's getting the buy-in, creating the structure and the framework for the program, really identifying all of those roles and responsibilities and making sure they're aligned with the goals. And having just the project management and the communication in place that's going to make all those partners feel like they're part of the process and feel like their goals are being met. And that doesn't just happen one time. It's not a technical hurdle that happens one time, but it has to keep going in perpetuity forever. That coordination has to stay in place. The software and technology keep getting better and more efficient, and there's absolutely a place for those tools in these processes, but there's no shortcut to getting all of the human factors, the coordination piece in place, and then continually supported for the long term.
Yeah, that is so true, Kate. And the slide here might be a bit of a curiosity, but let me explain that. I did a little bit of research for one of our clients earlier this year to take a look at how some of the states were organizing around next gen 911 requirements. And I made a bunch of phone calls and talked to folks to understand their models. And what I saw is that in a number of states, particularly the smaller states in the Northeast, they tend to be gravitating toward a centralized model. But surprisingly, Kansas, of all the calls I made, by far had the most mature federated model around the way they were managing, particularly the address data for next gen 911. And you can see on this slide here, they've been at this for a long time. Multiple years to really work through all these issues. And it really is work to do this, to get everybody on board, to define the governance structure, to define the standards that everyone is going to come to terms with, to put the shared platform tools in place to make that possible, to have the QA processes and the oversight and management, the continual need to communicate all these things across the whole range of stakeholders. So it's a lot of work, and I thought Kansas had done a really good job and have done a really nice job of documenting all of that. So I really point that out as an exemplar of how to implement a really strong federated enterprise data approach.
Bill, it sounds like Kansas should be one of our use cases in the webinars later this fall. So,
right.
We've touched on imagery and addresses, NG911, the imagery and addresses being two of the framework data layers. But it's worth mentioning how others might align with these models for data management and data governance. So if you take transportation, for example, a federated model would likely align best with transportation data sets, as they're often created locally, but the state provides direction and facilitates a roll-up. With the Federal Highway Arnold program, the state DOT must coordinate with all those local governments and include those local roads in an annual GIS data submission to FHWA. Now, historically, the state DOT didn't care much about the local roads. They were more focused on the state and federal highway systems, but Arnold creates this business driver, that Bill was talking about earlier, these drivers and requirements for them to coordinate with the locals and include that data in the submission.
Yeah, that is so true. I don't know if you remember, Kate, but I actually started my career at the New York DOT, worked 17 years there. And I can tell you that that's very true, that the total focus of a state DOT is on the state and federal highway network and not on the local system. So that was a big shift among the transportation community when FHWA implemented the Arnold program.
Mm-hmm.
But another example among these framework layers is the geodetic control networks. Now, what we're seeing is that there are big changes coming in the control networks being led by the National Geodetic Survey. So here we have a national program, and NGS has been working very closely with the states because it's the surveying community in the states that really densify and maintain these control networks. So it is another good example of one that fits very well with a federated structure. And I think we're going to see that now in 2022 as these new modernized networks roll out and how that's working across the country.
Mm-hmm. So let's just take a moment to think about these external business drivers, external factors that they're probably, they're playing a big part in how GIOs are thinking about how to approach data governance. They're business drivers mentioned here, the National Address Database, the migration to NG 911, the Geospatial Data Act, broadband mapping, the resurgence of that need, and of course the HPMS Arnold that we mentioned. These are all impacting data governance models. And as you navigate and participate in and support these initiatives, it's really important to have this framework in mind, to think about how are you going to achieve participation and success in the near term, and then how are you going to support this long term? How do the models align with the relationships of the data contributors in your state? What is the nature of authority between the different stakeholders and entities? How do you adapt your processes? What influence do you have to change processes that are in place in the state? How do you really affect change and make these successful? So strategizing for these really starts with having that framework for understanding. It helps the conversation move forward and really gives you a way to think about it in the near term and long term.
Yeah, I heartily agree with all of that, Kate. And, there are some other external factors to think about as well that also impact, your overall strategy, your overall thinking about where you want to end up on that continuum among these three models. For example, we're seeing a lot of movement now to the cloud and web delivery service platform models. And these tend to move to a larger enterprise as opposed to separate, smaller entities. Things come together in these larger technology platform worlds that we're dealing with. And similarly, we're seeing this whole concept of blended data, where we mix government data with the data that comes increasingly prevalent in the private sector. And so how do we do that in an enterprise capacity, and how do we govern that? How do we make sure that is consistent and available and documented and QA'd and all that when you're blending from multiple sources? And increasingly we're seeing, everything is more data driven these days. And the public at large is demanding more and better data from everybody, including the public sector. And so having high quality enterprise data is really the name of the game. And you need a strong understanding of what you're doing, and that's built on these models that we're talking about. And so really having that depth of understanding will help you structure your programs the right way.
Yeah, there's so much to consider here, and there really is no one right answer, across the board for every state.